My mother abandoned me, and I lost my father. Life is so hard for me. My name is Paul. I was born into hardship in the bustling city of Lagos. My earliest memory is of my mother walking out on us. No explanation, no warning. Just an empty space where love used to live. My father tried to hold us together, but the weight of survival was too much. Illness claimed him when I was barely 13. In a matter of months, I became an orphan with nothing but a will to keep breathing. But even then, I knew I couldn't let poverty write the final chapter of my story. With flickering candlelight and borrowed textbooks, I pushed through every obstacle. I became the boy who tutored others just to afford food, who walked for miles to attend classes, who didn't own a proper pair of shoes until university. Years passed, and I graduated with a first-class degree in civil engineering. It was meant to be my ticket out of hardship. I truly believe that, but reality doesn't always respect hard work. I knocked on doors with hope in my heart and rejection letters in my hands. 10, 20. I lost count. Each job application ended the same way: silence or false promises. I watched lesser qualified classmates secure roles through connections I never had. Eventually, hunger pushed me to accept what I could find: a job on a construction site, not as the engineer I trained to be, but as a laborer. I carried blocks and mixed concrete alongside men who never saw the inside of a university. I swallowed my pride with every bucket of sand. My palms blistered, my shoulders ached. But I worked with a quiet dignity, believing something better had to come. And then it did. One of the site supervisors noticed me. He had been watching, seeing how I arrived early, how I never complained, how I paid attention even when no one was looking. He gave me a chance, a blueprint to review, a mistake to correct, a small test that would change everything. From there, the tide began to turn. I wasn't just lifting blocks anymore. I was reading structural drawings, calculating loads, pointing out inefficiencies. Slowly, my role shifted. They started calling me supervisor, not laborer. And with that new title came an unfamiliar feeling: respect. Then came the moment that felt like destiny waking up. I was invited to join a new project, not as a helper, but as an engineer. My hands, once cracked and dirty from lifting concrete, would now help shape the design of buildings. For the first time in years, I saw a future that wasn't survival, but purpose. Stepping into the role of site supervisor didn't feel like a victory at first. It felt like betrayal. The same boots I had worn in the trenches of labor were now standing in the shade while others carried loads. The same hands that had bled beside theirs were now pointing, directing, reviewing. I hadn't asked for the distance, but it came anyway, quietly, like a crack forming beneath the surface. Some of the men I had once shared bread with now avoided my gaze. Conversations stopped when I walked past. Laughter faded into silence. What used to be camaraderie had turned into cold courtesy. I had been their brother. Now, I was just the boss. It didn't take long before the whispers began. Educated people don't understand real work. It was just luck that got him there. Now he wants to act like he's better than us. At first, I pretended not to hear, but silence has a way of screaming when you're alone. I began to question myself. Had I changed? Had this shirt, this new title, made me less human in their eyes? I knew I had to act, not speak. So, I started showing up earlier than everyone else, not to supervise, but to sweep the site. I cleaned the corners others ignored. I stacked bricks before the laborers arrived. I helped mix concrete when machines stalled and joined in lifting scaffolding when hands were few. I stopped giving instructions from a distance and started offering help up close. The transformation was not instant. At first they watched with suspicion, then with curiosity. Then, slowly, with a reluctant nod of approval. Musa, the oldest on site, offered me a bottle of water one hot afternoon, without me asking. That small gesture was the first crack in the wall between us. Respect was no longer tied to my degree or title. It came from showing that I hadn't forgotten the dust, the sweat, the ache. I had once stood where they stood, and I still remembered what it felt like. Over time, I made it a point to include them in decisions, not just issue commands. When plans changed, I explained why. When mistakes were made, I owned them. I wasn't leading from above. I was walking among them, carrying a different responsibility, yes, but still one of them. And something changed. The laughter returned, not the mockery, but the real kind, the kind shared between those who trust. Advice began to flow again, not just orders. They started calling me Engineer Paul, with something more than sarcasm. There was pride in it now. It wasn't the title that earned their respect. It was remembering where I came from and proving with every action that I hadn't left it behind. The letter came on a humid Tuesday afternoon. It was sealed in a crisp white envelope, stamped with the logo of a prestigious international engineering institute. I held it in my hands for minutes before opening it, as if my future would burst out the moment I tore through the paper. Inside was an invitation, an elite training program overseas, fully funded, personally recommended by Mr. Adebayo. It was the kind of opportunity that changes lives, the kind you don't say no to. For a long time I just stared at the words. It felt surreal. Just a year ago, I was mixing cement and sleeping on a torn mat in a one-room apartment. Now, the world was offering itself to me. But the excitement quickly gave way to something heavier. To accept meant leaving the site, leaving the man who had once doubted me, then stood beside me. The same man I had worked to earn back brick by brick. I knew they had come to trust me, not because I was better, but because I hadn't left them behind. Now it seemed I was about to do just that. The news spread fast, faster than I expected, and not everyone received it well. Some congratulated me, but their eyes held something else: envy, resentment, suspicion. Others didn't hide it at all. Rumors began swirling like dust on dry concrete. He thinks he's too good for us now. Maybe he pulled some strings? Let him go. We'll see if he survives without us. Then came the sabotage. One morning, I arrived to find incorrect measurements marked on the foundation layout. A detail I always triple-checked. A mistake that could cost millions. My name was already on the report, falsely signed. Someone had forged it. Later that week, a shipment of materials was misplaced under my oversight. I hadn't authorized the delivery, but the record said otherwise. It was subtle, calculated. Someone was trying to tarnish my name before I left. The worst part wasn't the damage to my reputation, it was the realization that the betrayal came from people I had trusted, people I had defended, shared meals with, laughed with. I was torn. I wanted to believe they acted out of fear, not hatred. Maybe they were afraid that if I left, no one would fight for them the way I did. Maybe they thought I would forget them once I reached higher ground. Still, I couldn't ignore what had happened. In the quiet of my small apartment, I stared at the acceptance letter again. The deadline to respond was approaching. A choice had to be made. Go, and risk losing everything I had built here. Stay, and possibly forfeit a future I had earned through blood and sweat. I didn't sleep that night. The decision felt like choosing between two lives. The one that had raised me and the one that could elevate me. The morning after the forged report surfaced, I walked into the office to an unfamiliar silence. The usual greetings were gone. No handshakes, no smiles, only eyes. Watching, judging, some disappointed, others satisfied. Mr. Adebayo was waiting. His face, usually calm, was carved in stone. On the table before him lay the falsified documents, the foundation error sheet, the material misplacement logs, all bearing my name, all screaming failure. He said nothing at first, just slid the papers toward me. The weight of those sheets was heavier than any block I had ever lifted. I opened my mouth to explain, but even I knew how it would sound. Convenient, defensive. Like a man caught in the act trying to twist the story. I had no proof. The forgery was clean. The errors looked real. The only thing I had was my integrity. And in that moment, it wasn't enough. Mr. Adebayo didn't accuse me directly, he didn't need to. His disappointment did the talking. By noon, word had spread beyond the site. Head office requested an internal audit. The upcoming training program, my dream, was put on hold pending investigation. Just like that, everything I had worked for began to unravel. Worse than the professional blow was the silence from the crew. The same men I had fought to win over now kept their distance. The old doubts resurfaced in their eyes. Perhaps he wasn't one of us after all. Perhaps the promotion really did go to his head. Perhaps we were wrong to trust him. Someone had framed me, and whoever it was had done it perfectly. Their goal wasn't just to derail my future, it was to destroy the bridge I had built between leadership and labor. And it was working. That evening, I stayed late at the site long after everyone had left. I walked the slabs of unfinished concrete, remembering each stage we had built together, each mistake we had corrected, each laugh we had shared. Now all of it felt like a lie, or worse, like something that had been stolen from me. But even in that darkness, something in me refused to break. This wasn't the first time life had pushed me to the edge. It wasn't the first time I'd been misunderstood, judged, or abandoned. And if I had to start from the bottom again, I would. But not before uncovering the truth. Someone wanted me gone, and I needed to find out who. Not for revenge, but for restoration. Not just to clear my name, but to restore the fragile trust that had taken me so long to earn. The audit took 2 weeks, but it felt like 2 years. Every file I had signed, every delivery I had approved, every step I had taken on that site was examined under a microscope. I answered questions daily, often repeating the same truths to different people who looked at me with the same blank expression. Not one of them said the word, but I could feel it behind every glance. Suspicion. The crew kept their distance. Even Musa, who once passed me water during the hottest days, now walked by without a nod. My efforts to lead, to earn trust, felt like distant echoes. Forgotten, irrelevant. Then came the report. I wasn't fired, but I was suspended from the project. Temporarily, they said, pending further clarity. But the meaning was clear. I had become a liability. And as for the training program, the door had been shut, quietly, finally, without apology. The result of the internal investigation stated that while no hard evidence could definitively prove my direct involvement in the sabotage, there were significant procedural lapses under my supervision, enough to justify pulling me from leadership, enough to smear the name I had fought so hard to protect. I stood outside the office that day, holding the letter in my hand, the sky above a dull, indifferent gray. I had nothing to say. For the first time in a long time, I had no plan. Everything I had worked for, the trust, the role, the opportunity, it had all been stripped away by a few forged papers, and a silence I couldn't break. I returned to my one-room apartment, the same one I had lived in when I was still a laborer. The walls felt smaller now, the air heavier. I sat on the edge of the bed, not knowing what to do with my hands or my thoughts. I had faced hunger, I had faced loss. But this hollowing of my dignity cut deeper. The despair didn't come in loud sobs, it came in stillness. In the slow realization that I was alone again. But even in that moment, something refused to die inside me. As I stared at the wrinkled letter on my table, I remembered my father's voice, soft and tired, whispering to me when I was young. Never let the world decide your worth, Paul. That is your fight. The thought didn't make things better, but it steadied me. I didn't know who framed me. Not yet, but someone had. And they were still out there, working, laughing, walking past me as if nothing happened. Perhaps they thought it was over, but they were wrong. Days passed like shadows, long, quiet, and heavy. Life after the suspension was unlike anything Paul had imagined. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was all too familiar. The noise, the dust, the rise of sun over Lagos rooftops, these things hadn't changed. But he had. Something in him had shifted. Gone were the early morning rushes to sight, the blueprints on his table, the steady rhythm of responsibility. In their place was stillness, too much of it. Paul would wake before dawn out of habit, then sit in silence, staring at the wall, unsure of what to do with himself. His alarm still rang, but purpose no longer followed it. Worse than the emptiness was the weight of judgment that followed him like a shadow. Word had spread, twisted versions of the truth whispered in barbershops and shared over cheap beer. To many, Paul was now the man who failed, the one who climbed too high and fell just as hard. He tried to find work elsewhere, but doors that once cracked open for a young first-class graduate were now tightly shut. His name, once respected, now raised eyebrows. But Paul was no stranger to survival. In the evenings, he helped a friend mix paints for a roadside furniture shop. It was back-breaking work again, brushing lacquer over cracked wood, inhaling fumes that left his head pounding. He earned just enough to eat, less than enough to dream. Yet something kept him grounded. He hadn't let go of the documents from the audit, the ones he had quietly copied before leaving the office. Names, numbers, deliveries that didn't add up. On the outside, he looked like a man defeated. But beneath the quiet, he was watching, remembering, connecting dots. One night, while organizing his worn notebook, he noticed something strange, a pattern in the supply chain logs. Multiple shipments marked as received on dates he distinctly remembered being delayed. He dug further, cross-checked with older site photos he had taken. Invoices billed for materials that never arrived. Workers signed off on deliveries they never saw. The more he looked, the clearer it became. Someone had been siphoning funds and covering it with ghost entries. The sabotage against him wasn't just about envy. It was about protection. He had come too close to something he was never meant to see. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about stopping a system that could collapse buildings and bury innocent men under slabs of greed. But Paul knew the danger of truth. He was no longer shielded by a title or protected by proximity to power. He was just a man with a broken reputation, a notebook full of observations, and a fierce desire to make things right. Paul knew that if he was going to uncover the truth, he had to leave the comfort of notes and suspicion. He needed real voices, real records, proof that couldn't be buried under accusations or bureaucracy. He started with old contacts, casual friendships built during his time on site. He approached them with caution, posing questions not as accusations, but as memories. Do you remember that delivery last August? The one with the foundation steel rods? Most replied with vague nods. Some genuinely couldn't recall. But one man, Emeka, a forklift operator who had worked on night shifts, leaned in and whispered. I remember it was delayed. It never came that week. But I heard it was signed off anyway. That was the thread Paul had been looking for. He visited supply depots in the outskirts of Lagos, tracing paperwork and delivery schedules that had long been buried under newer transactions. He rode buses packed with tired workers, walked through muddy paths into supplier yards, sat in stuffy roadside restaurants buying bowls of pepper soup to get people talking. Bit by bit, the fragments came together. Multiple deliveries had been forged, products invoiced but never delivered, materials swapped for cheaper alternatives, subcontractors paid off to keep quiet. What was most alarming wasn't the theft, it was the scale of it. It wasn't a single greedy staff member, it was a network, a well-oiled machine of corruption that stretched beyond the site, beyond the local office, up into senior management. Paul couldn't believe how close he had been to it all this time. His demotion hadn't been just a reaction to a forged report, it had been preemptive, a shield. They needed him out of the way. But now, they were aware he hadn't stayed silent. He noticed it first at the junction near his apartment, a black car that paused too long. Then again, 2 nights later, footsteps behind him that stopped when he turned. A phone call that rang once and dropped every evening at the same time. No one spoke, but someone was definitely watching. Still, he pressed on. He bought a cheap burner phone and backed up everything he had found. Scanned copies of falsified documents, voice recordings of hesitant admissions, even photos of warehouses that were never stocked. He hid the originals in a metal box under loose floorboards in his room. He trusted no one, not even his own habits. The danger didn't scare him as much as the silence did. The more he uncovered, the more isolated he became. There were no allies, no safety nets, just Paul, and the truth he now carried like a ticking bomb. He began to question his next step. Should he go to the media, hand it all to the authorities? But in Nigeria, even justice had a price. The wrong move could make him disappear, quietly, like so many before him. And yet, doing nothing was no longer an option. People could die if construction continued with inferior materials. Lives were at stake. The night before Paul was to meet with the journalist, he couldn't sleep. The weight of everything he had uncovered pressed on him like a vice. The phone in his pocket felt heavier than it should, filled with evidence that could shatter lives, expose corruption, and destroy the fragile world he had rebuilt. But Paul knew it was bigger than him. The stolen materials weren't just about money, they were about safety. The very foundations of the buildings were compromised. If he didn't act, innocent people would die. The meeting with Amina, the investigative journalist, was set. She had worked on similar stories before, uncovering corruption in the local government and construction sectors. Paul had met her in a cafe weeks ago, after much hesitation, and now she was the only person he trusted to take the story to the media without selling it out. The city hummed outside his apartment, but inside everything was still. He sat at the desk in his cramped room, scanning through the documents once more, verifying each detail. A knock at the door broke his concentration. He hesitated before answering. No one came to his apartment at this hour. When he opened it, no one was there. Just as he was about to turn back inside, something caught his eye. A small envelope wedged beneath the door. It was plain, unmarked, but the edges were ragged, like it had been hurriedly shoved through. His heart skipped. Paul picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph of him walking down the street the day before, just before he had met Amina. The message on the back was clear. Stop now, or you will regret it. His blood ran cold. He'd been followed. The threat was real. He stuffed the photo back in the envelope and glanced around his apartment, feeling the walls close in. He had never been this exposed before, this vulnerable, but the evidence was too important. The story needed to be told. He left his apartment just before midnight, not wanting to attract attention. His phone buzzed with a message from Amina. Ready for tomorrow? He stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Yes, but I need you to be careful. I'm being watched. His hand shook slightly as he hit send, but the message went through. He couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. When he arrived back at his apartment hours later, the door was ajar. He froze. His heart thudded in his chest as he slowly stepped inside. The room was a mess. Drawers were pulled out, files were scattered across the floor, and papers were ripped in half. The metal box beneath the floorboards where he had hidden the evidence was gone. His worst fear had come true. They knew. They had found it. Someone had come for the truth. The evidence that could expose everything had been taken. His eyes darted across the room, searching for anything left untouched. But the scene was too chaotic. The intruders had been thorough. On the desk, a small object was left behind. A single black feather. It was strange, out of place, and it sent a shiver down his spine. Paul bent down to pick it up, his fingers trembling as he studied it. It was a warning, an unmistakable sign that someone in the shadows was orchestrating this. The same shadow that had been following him. The same one that had taken everything he had worked for. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Amina. Paul? Where are you? I'm on my way. Paul stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the decision before him. They had stolen his files. They had warned him. But now, they had crossed a line. He couldn't turn back. With determination rising within him, Paul packed what little he had left. His phone, the burned backup files, and the single feather. He needed to get out of the apartment, out of the city, and meet Amina. If they were going to silence him, they would have to do it face to face. Paul chose the meeting spot carefully. A dusty, half-abandoned bus terminal just outside the city limits. It was far from familiar eyes, far from the surveillance and shadowy figures that had haunted him these past few weeks. He arrived just after sunset, wearing a faded cap and dark hoodie, carrying the last remaining backups of the evidence on a flash drive. The air was heavy with dust and diesel fumes. Rusted buses sat like forgotten giants, their windows shattered and wheels half sunk into the cracked earth. The only sound was the low hum of insects and the occasional bark of distant dogs. Amina arrived 10 minutes later. She stepped out of a small cab, dressed in plain clothes, her bag slung over her shoulder. Even in the failing light, her eyes were sharp, searching, scanning. "You okay?" she asked as she approached. Paul gave a slight nod. "They found my apartment, took everything, but I made copies." He held up the flash drive, a simple object that now felt like the most dangerous thing he owned. Amina's expression turned grave. "We need to move quickly. I've arranged a secure server. Once it's uploaded, it can't be erased." She turned to lead him back toward the cab when the first shot rang out. The crack split the air like lightning. Paul dove behind a broken-down bus as the windshield of Amina's cab exploded. Screams echoed across the empty lot, Amina's voice cutting through as she tried to run. 3 men emerged from the shadows, faces hidden, movements practiced. One of them reached Amina before she could flee. She fought. Paul saw her elbow her attacker, twist, shout. But they were too many. In seconds, she was overpowered, dragged into the back of a dark SUV that had slipped in silently behind the wreckage. Paul moved to rush toward her, but a sharp pain tore through his shoulder. He stumbled backward, falling hard, breath knocked from his lungs. He'd been shot. Clean, not fatal, but enough to paralyze him for the moment. The SUV peeled away in a storm of dust, disappearing into the night with Amina inside. Paul crawled behind the bus, blood seeping into his shirt, clutching the flash drive tightly in one hand. He didn't know how long he stayed there, minutes, maybe hours, until the sounds of engines faded and the world went silent again. He was alone, wounded, hunted, and she was gone. But they hadn't taken the drive. The fear that gripped him was immense, but it was no longer just about him. Amina had risked everything. She had trusted him. Now she was paying the price. Paul tore a strip from his shirt to slow the bleeding. Every movement sent pain shooting through his side, but he forced himself upright, one hand braced against the side of the bus. He looked out over the deserted terminal. They had wanted to silence him, but in trying to bury the truth, they had made it personal. And now, he was out of hiding. Paul woke up in a dimly lit room that smelled of dust and antiseptic. His shoulder was wrapped tightly, the pain dulled by whatever makeshift treatment had been given. The ceiling fan above creaked as it spun lazily. He tried to sit up and groaned. "You shouldn't be moving yet," a voice said gently. It was Whale, an old friend from university who now worked with an underground press group known for exposing government fraud. Paul had reached out to him the night after the ambush, barely coherent from blood loss. It had been Whale who found him near the bus terminal, dragged him to safety and patched him up. "I need to get the story out," Paul muttered. "They took Amina. And they'll take more if this isn't stopped," Whale said. "But we're going to help you." Over the next few days, Paul worked feverishly with Whale's team to recover, secure, and share everything he knew. The flash drive he'd risked his life to protect contained all the evidence: fake receipts, bribery records, tampered safety reports, and emails tying the corruption to senior management at the company. The press team launched the story through encrypted channels, distributing it to major newspapers, international media, and legal watchdogs. Names were named. Proof was undeniable. Within 48 hours, the story went viral. The fallout was immediate. Government investigators opened inquiries, arrests were made. The engineering company's CEO was summoned. Several managers were detained. And through it all, Paul's name became known, not as the disgraced scapegoat, but as the courageous whistleblower who had risked everything to do the right thing. Then came news that brought him to tears. Amina had been rescued during a raid on an unregistered facility outside the city. She had been held for 3 days, blindfolded and isolated, but she was alive and she hadn't broken. He'll finish what we started, she told the press from her hospital bed. Paul did. Within weeks, he received calls from international NGOs and engineering firms. They praised his integrity, his leadership, and most of all, his bravery. The United Kingdom's Royal Institution of Civil Engineers extended a scholarship and a special placement in one of their most prestigious infrastructure teams. He left Nigeria with a heavy heart but a clear purpose. In London, Paul walked into his new office as an essential engineer, designing bridges, tunnels, and transportation systems that would serve millions. He didn't arrive with wealth or a long resume. He arrived with fire-tested character and the scars to prove it. There were moments he still thought of the old construction site, of the smell of wet cement, of Musa offering him water under the hot sun, of the laughter that returned when respect replaced resentment. He never forgot those faces or those struggles. Months later, during a public lecture at an engineering summit, he stood at the podium in front of professionals, scholars, and young students. He shared his story, not just the success, but the pain, the betrayal, and the choices that nearly broke him. "I was born into dust," he told them, "but dust does not define destiny. Character does, period." Back home, the story of Engineer Paul became a lesson told in classrooms and job sites. His photo, once shared with malice, now appeared in newspapers beside headlines like "From Laborer to Leader" and "The Man Who Chose Truth." As for those who once mocked him, who whispered behind his back and tried to destroy him, they watched from the sidelines. Some were humbled, others silenced. But none could deny what Paul had become. He had risen, not just as an engineer, but as a symbol. A symbol that no matter how low you start, you are not your beginnings, you are your choices.